Hello everyone and welcome to this session on Ovid's Ars Amatoria 3. For this talk I want to use the OCR textbook for the Love and Relationships module as a kind of springboard. I'm going to be aiming to expand, sometimes critically and with reference to some recent scholarship, on the various points that the authors of the textbook make about Ars 3. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some useful material and stimulus which will help you get the most out of this fascinating text. As well as the PowerPoint, I've also made a handout which indicates the scholarship I've given you as PDFs. So in this talk, I want to discuss 4 intersecting issues that you can see on the slide here, which I'm first going to approach broadly in terms that develop the textbook points with a bit more nuance. I'm then going to pause to discuss the opening passage of the book in a bit more detail. I'm going to say something about the notion of reading this text in its social political context, first of all. I'm going to say something about the paradoxes of the key nouns Amor and Ars in the poem, make a couple of points about form and genre, and finally explore ways into the double audience conundrum of Ars 3 and the dynamic of doubleness and reversibility more generally that propels Ovid's entire elegiac project and is, we might want to say, exemplified by Ars 3. So let's start with the presumption on the first page of your textbook chapter on Ovid that, I quote, Ars 3 provides a fascinating insight into the lives and loves of women, a point that leads into discussion of how the poem as a whole can be read through the lens of exile as a socio-political document that performs a kind of mischievous backlash against Augustan moral legislation. I want to say straight away that this isn't a text we can mine straightforwardly for embedded historical truths or for fully formed political ideas, or for what we might be conditioned to read as reflections of a political backdrop. Ars 3 is only a source for the ancient historian interested in the Middle Augustan period, insofar as it overtly participates in and helps shape cultural political discourses about what it means to live in an increasingly modern, wealthy, peaceful metropolis, and in a regime that puts new emphasis on the morality and decorum of private life as a political or politicized issue. And I'd want to impress upon A-level students that the world created in the Ars Amatoria is very much a fictional make-believe lover's world that has a layered literary history, which of course doesn't mean that this fiction is not doing political work. As your textbook suggests, the Ars as a whole has often been retro-engineered through the crime and punishment narrative of Ovidian exile, and as a result has tended to be packaged in scholarship as provocative and Augustan or anti-Augustan. Now, while it's true that in order to understand the Ars, it's helpful to be aware of the legal reforms in 18 BC, which criminalized a range of sexual offences, including adultery, for the first time, and these laws are alluded to fairly directly in Ars 3, for example, at line 58. Nevertheless, it's important to observe 2 things, and I'll try to put this to you as succinctly as possible. First, that many scholars have pushed back against or have complicated the notion of Ovid's anti-Augustan position by tracing the extent to which the Ars projects, as Tom Habnick puts it, a kind of internalization of the imperial project. Cupid himself channels imperial expansionism from the Amores onwards, and Ars 1 and 2 are all about how the militaristic logic of domination and colonization permeates the lives of elegiac lovers, whose lifestyles are very much contingent on the luxuries afforded by imperial success. And this is all set in a metropolis, of course, that it is itself a showcase of imperial power. A good passage to discuss with students, which really captures this spirit, is Ars 1, 171 to 228, one of the few passages in the poem that we might call genuinely propagandistic. Here the Praeceptors suggest that the military triumph to celebrate the successful campaign of Gaius Caesar against the Parthians is a good opportunity to pick up women, and he aligns this military revenge for the humiliation of the Battle of Carrhae with sexual conquest. In Ars 3, the figure of the conquered Parthian returns in quite an interesting way at line 248. This is where the poet shames women who are caught out by a lover in the morning before they have time to put on their wig properly. And he adds that he really only wishes this indignity on Parthian women. The irony being that the wig itself, made out of German hair, as he's just said, is symbolic of another military victory, another success story for colonial power. Ovid's Puella in Ars 3 is made up and coiffed literally as a quintessential imperial subject, a subject who nevertheless gives male audiences the satisfaction of replaying the violence of imperial domination within internal Roman hierarchies of gender and class. Scholars like Tom Habernick make us very aware that countercultural discourses, or what might look like countercultural discourses, can and often do work in the service of power, in the interests of power, are enfolded into power. Secondly, we might observe that the very idea that the Ars is a politically subversive poem is an approach that begins with and is legitimised by Ovid himself in the exile poetry, and indeed before that in the Remedia Amoris. In other words, one of the things that makes Ovid distinctive is the way in which he thematizes, constructs, and performs across a nexus of works his own evolving reception. He continually rehearses his own self-sabotage, his own provocative guilt, for which he atones, or perhaps doesn't quite atone, in the Tristia and Epistulae ex Ponto. I've included among your PDFs Sergio Casali's chapter from 2006, which explores Ovid's own construction of his relationship with imperial power, and makes the very important point that when we say that the Ars Amatoria is anti-Augustan, what we're doing is reproducing Ovid's own multi-part fiction. We are, as Casali puts it, displaying docile obedience to the reception of the Ars in the terms described by Ovid, or prescribed by Ovid. And one of the more nuanced ways in which we can approach the Ars as a political text, which is fully invested in the social political world of which it is a part, is to discuss Ovid's interest in persuasion, in simulation and verbal spin, because his lover is above all a politician, a master of illusion and of rhetorical manipulation. So there are interesting parallels between what we can glean elsewhere in ancient texts about the Augustan regime's staging of diplomatic and military actions as a sort of politics of spectacle, and the kind of lover the poet-teacher wants to train up in the Ars Amatoria. So, as I've said here on this slide, although the elegiac lover rejects public political life, he is also a soldier of love who is in many ways a quintessential imperial subject, a subject whose key concern is with the politics of representation. So it's a good idea, again, to return briefly to Ars 1 to show students how this idea takes shape in the text. Seduction is above all verbal in Ovid. It's an art of persuasion. So in Book 1, 437 to 504, as I've noted here, the lover must first persuade and verbally manipulate domestic slaves, and then approach the girl with letters written on wax tablets that are designed to deceive. We might compare the equivalent, as it were, in Ars 3, where women are reminded of the importance of professionalism and art in gesture, speech, and song. This leads me on to the second area of discussion, the nature of Amor and Ars as key terms and concepts in the poem. And again, I would want to complicate slightly the outline given in your OCR textbook. When we say that the Ovidian lover is an imperial subject, it's important to say that this is a subject that is always coming into being, always unstable, never quite the conqueror, or at least not for long. From the very beginning of his career, Ovid is interested in psychological as well as physical metamorphosis. And this point gets right to the heart of what Ovidian elegy is all about. Ovid's male subject in particular is a compromised one in Roman cultural terms, insofar as his ideal masculine invulnerability is always already undone by desire. Because desire creates need, it creates dependency, and is thought of as a penetrating, feminizing, and enslaving wound in Roman thought. The elegiac couplet itself, as Ovid conceives it at the beginning of the Amores, and you've got the relevant passage here, combines in his image, the virile, robust, epic hexameter with the weaker, literally inferior, chopped off pentameter. So we can see here, if you read this passage, it's a very famous programmatic drama, if you like, in which the 6-foot hexameter is seen to lose a foot to become the pentameter. And from this point onwards, or from at least from Amores 1:1, 17 to 18 onwards, as you've got here, all Ovidian elegy enacts or reenacts this undular pattern of masculine tumescence followed by wounded deflation. So coming on to point 2 now. It's true to say, as the textbook states, that amor means desire rather than what modern thought construes as romantic love. And that Ars is best understood as techne, a skill. The Ars Amatoria turns the dating game into a pseudo-science, something that can be learned, mastered, and applied. But this is an aim and a process. It's not a fail-safe method. Underpinning the playfulness and complexity of this poem is the idea that amor can never be reliably converted into ratio. There is always potentially impetus, a bacchic force that in Stoic terms, mock Stoic or quasi-Stoic terms, makes victims of anyone who desires. And because victimization and woundedness are gendered as female in Ovid and in Roman thought generally, this gives Ovid's representations of women and of male-female interactions an interesting unpredictability. It's not simply the case that Ovid constructs a masterful, successful male lover in Ars 1 and 2, and then arms female lovers to fight back in Ars 3. To begin with, this is complicated from the outset by the poet's admission that he is always a lover himself, and is possibly competing to seduce the same girls. The male lover's intermittent or perpetual failure, framed by the irony that it may be impossible to produce fail-safe teachings on how to have successful relationships, is the fuel that drives this poem from the beginning, before we even get to Ars 3. Falling into traps, messing up, getting hurt, being deceived, conning others, and reveling in fantasy and illusion are part of the seductiveness and pleasure of this world. This means that the clear-sightedness and scientific knowledge promoted by Ovid's predecessor Lucretius, who warns about the deceptions and dangers of Amor in Book 3 of his epic on the nature of things, are antithetical to the very project of Ovidian elegy from the outset, even for the lover who wants to turn Amor into Ars. So, for example, as you can see on this slide, in Ars 1, 611, Ovid famously instructs the male addressee on acting the part. Est tibi agendus amans, you must play the role of the lover. And this notion of role play is one of the most obvious ways, I suppose, in which the theatre of Ovidian elegy engages with and remakes Greek and Roman new comedy. But already a few lines later, he warns the student to watch out, because acting a part can make it real. You can set out intending to manipulate women to satisfy your own desires without any of those silly female emotions getting in your way. But all of a sudden, and at a point you cannot predict, Amor pierces you and your feelings take over. This is reiterated, as you can see here, in the Remedia Amoris at 497 and following, when the poet advises traumatized patients to cover up their pain and suggests that this behavioral therapy will over time actually get rid of the underlying emotions. But then he adds, I have often laughed at one deceived who pretended to love and then fell like a bird catcher into his own snare. This overt reference to Ars 1 at once affirms and undermines his therapy by suggesting that the same self-deception that he's recommending here got lovers into trouble in the first place. And implicitly, if they carry on acting, they are liable to get caught out again rather than be cured of love. So the game of illusion and being a political spin doctor effectively keeps them within the realm of erotic elegy. To summarise then, so before we even get to the table turning of Ars 3, the praeceptor is already in the business of undermining, toying with, and wrong-footing his imagined addressee, with an eye, of course, on his cultured audience, who, like the clever lover, is able to read between the lines and tease out the layered perspectives and unstable positions. To say that love is just a game in Ovid is to flatten out the liveness, seductiveness, and challenge of this poetry. It is at best a high-risk game, which puts the spotlight on our own impressionability, our own vulnerability or desire as readers. Some of your students may have come across Donna Zuckerberg's, the cover is on your left there, her recent book, which is called Not All Dead White Men, Classics of Misogyny in the Digital Age, which has an entire chapter on the influence and use of Ovid's Ars by misogynistic men's rights communities, which mainly operate online. And these communities invariably pursue a perversely literalist reading of the Ars as offering genuine practical advice to young men on how to date, seduce, and entrap women. But what these and other fundamentalists must ignore or edit out of the Ars is its dynamic of self-sabotage in poetic language, of course, which works to undermine any lover over-invested in that sense of arrogant, impervious, and highly gendered control. Ovid shows that this kind of power is not just unstable, more importantly, it's also incompatible with erotic desire and therefore with erotic pleasure. It is itself, ironically, self-defeating. Needless to say, none of this means that the Ars is not a text immersed in misogynistic ideas. It clearly is in many ways. But what's interesting from a contemporary feminist perspective is Ovid's acute awareness of the gendered structures of power, particularly the way he unconceals the lie of masculine invulnerability and non-dependency. I mean, in that sense, his poetics could not be further removed from the woman-hating ideologies of the men's rights chat room. So let's look finally at the issue of the female or double audience of Ars 3. This is point 3 leading into point 4 if you're following also on the handout. As an aside, I put that little bit of your OCR textbook again, because it's odd that the textbook implies that this double audience changes the tone of the poem and makes it more of a parody of didactic poetry. So it's as if parody is presented as diminishing the poem's value, a value that must be predicated on the recuperation of seriousness. In other words, if the poem is fun, the textbook is implying it must also be superficial, which is not, of course, the case. So I'd recommend the introduction to Roy Gibson's commentary in Ars 3 and the David Sider article I've given you as a PDF if you're looking to develop students' understanding of ancient didactic other than the trajectory from Hesiod to Lucretius and Virgil, and looking to develop their understanding of didactic as not simply one thing. So to return to this problem of the audience, in a sense, the audience of this poem has always been double, in that the imagined constructed addressee is not necessarily the same as the poem's readers. As I said earlier, the poet himself also takes up a double position that infers often a comic conflict of interests. He is a teacher, in other words, but he's also a fellow lover and protagonist in the poem. One of the obvious things to say about Ars 3 is that it offers male readers the opportunity to laugh at a supposed audience of low-class women. And this scene of men eavesdropping on women receiving lessons in love is already familiar from New Comedy and from earlier erotic elegy, particularly Ovid, Amores 1:8. Yet, if we look at the first passage of Ars 3, we see that the first addressees of the poem, of the book, are not women, but homines, men. And the mythological figure for a putative female audience, the Amazon Penthesilea, this is the first two lines of the poem, reminds readers of the narrative in which Achilles falls in love with Penthesilea after or as he is fatally stabbing her. Women's defeat is subtly written into the backlash from the very first line, we might say, so that injunction to go into war equal is already a joke. And I've noticed various references here to the representation of this scene in Greco-Roman art from the Archaic period onwards. Then if we look at lines 7 to 8 of Book 3, these are also interesting in that here the poet imagines an intervention by a male lover, a male reader, somebody who has a pretty fragile ego, who interrupts and objects, and compares the strategy of Ars 3 to letting a rabid she-wolf loose on a flock of sheep. Some guy or other will say to me, why do you add poison to snakes and betray the sheep to the rabid she-wolf? Now, as Gibson's commentary will tell you, this animal metaphor or double metaphor works not just because it's a classic misogynistic construct of the all-devouring phallic female. It also works because lupa in Latin, the word for she-wolf, also means prostitute, particularly low-class prostitute. But note also that Ovid has this male lover refer to himself as a passive sheep. And the notion of male shame was already flagged in line 6. So you might ask at this point, who exactly is being made fun of? simply a low-class female audience, or in addition, a imagined male audience. The poet's own defense of women in the lines that follow is satirically double-edged, we might say. First of all, lines 9 to 10, where he says, "Don't charge all women with the crimes of a few," are troubled by echoes of his very different take in Ars 1, 645 and following, where he says, "Deceive the deceivers. They, as in women, are mostly a wicked sort." So can the praeceptor be trusted? Is he two-faced? Is the imagined male addressee being provoked into remembering what he's supposed to have learned in Ars 1 and being tested here? It's indicative, perhaps, that the poet's defence of women in lines 9 and following begins with a catalogue of cheating, violent women, Helen, Clytemnestra, Euryphile. The list then is followed by a but. So, there are these cheating women, but on the other hand, I give you chaste Penelope and self-sacrificing Alcestis, and so on. Yet we might find humour for both men and women in the notion of a mischievous praeceptor amoris filling his rather pathetic, fragile-egoed male addressee with fear at all these rabid women that he might encounter. Likewise, we might explore the comic inappropriateness of these mythological allusions, which all seem to involve married couples, where marriage is supposed to be the last thing on the minds of adulterous young lovers in this world. A bit further on, this is the last citation on this slide, at lines 33 to 4, the outrageous first example that the praeceptor gives of men being actually far more deceitful and violent than women is Jason's abandonment of Medea. Not mentioning, of course, that this is a woman who will go on to murder his children and his new bride. In other words, this isn't just about imagining a male audience sniggering over the shoulder of an audience of gullible women. The mechanism of satiric reversibility is overt throughout this book. And I don't have time to discuss this in detail, but I just mention it because it's an important element of recent scholarship. Another way that this reversibility operates is in the counterintuitive way in which the poet promotes restraint, decorum, and propriety in his female addressee, as if he is teaching her how to become the proper matrona, or how to, rather in Ovidian terms, disguise herself as the proper matrona. And this move is extensively explored by Roy Gibson in bibliography that I've given you in PDF form. And it's interesting because it ironically both buys into the spirit of Augustan moral reform and at the same time contravenes it. So I wish I could talk more, but I fear I have run out of time and come to my 30 minutes. But many thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.